The silence of her father's house was a thin, brittle thing, easily shattered by the cough that rattled in his chest or the scuttling of mice in the wainscoting. Elara felt the silence not as peace, but as a weight. It was the sound of waiting for the last of their meager funds to evaporate, for the final threadbare tapestry to be sold, for the life she knew, however small, to finally and completely end. She sat by the window, the afternoon light the color of weak tea, mending a lace collar that was more stitch than original fabric. At 24, she was a creature of mended things, a woman held together by careful, invisible repairs. Her future was a set of bleak, well-trod paths. She could become a companion to some sour-faced widow, her days measured in spoonfuls of medicine and chapters read aloud from dreary sermons, or a governess, molding the minds of children who would one day look through her as if she were glass. The third path, the one her father prayed for with the desperation of a ruined man, was marriage. But the local prospects were grim, gout-ridden squires and grasping merchants who would see her not as a wife, but as a bargain, a lady's title purchased at a steep discount. She had long ago resigned herself to this quiet fading. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of their decaying manor, a place where memories hung in the air like dust motes, visible only when a stray beam of sun pierced the gloom. She had her books, her small, secret sketches of the weeds that grew with defiant beauty in the cracks of the garden flagstones. It was not a life, but an existence, a prolonged pause before an inevitable decline. She expected nothing more. She hoped for nothing more. Hope was a currency she could no longer afford. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a rider whose livery was so crisp and immaculate it seemed to mock the peeling paint of their front door. It bore a seal of black wax, impressed with the crest of a wolf's head, stark and severe. The Duchy of Blackwood. A name that was a legend, a synonym for immense wealth, ancient power, and impenetrable society. Elara's father, his hands trembling, broke the seal. He read it once, his eyes wide with disbelief. He read it again, a choked, grasping sound escaping his throat. He thrust the parchment at her. "Read it," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "Read what Providence has delivered." Elara took the heavy paper. The script was a woman's, elegant and imperious. It was from Isabella, the Duchess Dowager of Blackwood. The words were brutally direct, stripped of all social nicety. Her Grace required a wife for her son, the Duke, a woman of good breeding, modest temperament, and no significant social connections that might prove complicated. Lady Elara Vance, daughter of the financially embarrassed Baron Vance, had been recommended as a suitable candidate. The letter did not propose a courtship, it stated a transaction. The most chilling line came last. "In light of your family's circumstances," it read, "I have taken the liberty of settling a dowry of £10,000 upon you myself, to be transferred upon the signing of the marriage contract." She was being purchased, not by the groom, but by his mother. Her father saw only the sum, the £10,000 that would save them from utter ruin. He saw the title, Duchess, that would be bestowed upon his daughter. He saw salvation. Elara saw a gilded cage and a woman she had never met holding the key. She felt a sudden, sharp chill, as if a window had blown open in the dead of winter. But refusal was impossible. It would be condemning her father, their name, their very existence, to oblivion. The choice was not a choice at all. It was merely the shape of her surrender. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a blur of grey skies and skeletal trees. Elara sat numbly in the carriage, the new travelling dress her father had bought, with the first small advance from the Duchess's solicitors, feeling stiff and foreign against her skin. She was leaving behind a life of quiet want for one of unknown and likely cold luxury. She clutched a small reticule in her lap, which contained only a book of botanical drawings and a miniature of her late mother. These were the only pieces of her true self she was bringing with her. The carriage rolled through iron gates vast enough for a king's army, the wolf's head crest repeated in stark, unforgiving metal. The drive was long, winding through an ancient park where the trees stood like grim sentinels. And then the house appeared, a great stone behemoth against the bruised twilight sky. Blackwood Manor did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress, a place designed to keep the world out and its secrets in. A footman, impassive as a statue, opened the carriage door. Elara stepped out, her legs unsteady. The great oak doors of the manor swung open, spilling a rectangle of cold golden light onto the gravel. She took a breath and walked inside. The great hall was cavernous, all dark wood, shadowed tapestries, and polished marble that reflected the candlelight like dark water. It was built to intimidate, to make any visitor feel small and insignificant. Standing at the base of a sweeping staircase were two figures. The woman was exactly as Elara had imagined from her letter, tall, severe, her silver hair coiled in a flawless arrangement, her black silk gown a suit of armor. This was Isabella, the Duchess Dowager. Beside her, and a half-step behind, stood a man. He was tall, dressed in dark, perfectly tailored clothes, his face a study in aristocratic impassivity. The Duke, her future husband. Elara moved forward into the light, her simple grey dress a whisper against the hall's booming grandeur. She stopped a polite distance away and executed a flawless curtsy. As she rose, she met the Duchess Dowager's eyes, directly, and in that moment the air in the hall seemed to solidify. The polite murmur of the assembled servants died. The crackle of the fire in the enormous hearth seemed to hush. The silence in the hall was absolute, stretching taut like a freshly waxed thread about to snap. She saw it then, a flicker in the Duchess Dowager's cool, assessing gaze. It was not anger, not disappointment, it was shock. A profound, bone-deep shock that the older woman concealed almost instantly behind a mask of icy composure. The Duchess had expected a girl, a timid, grateful, mousy creature overwhelmed by her new surroundings, easily molded, easily controlled. She had paid for a shadow. But the woman who stood before her was not a shadow. Elara was not a classical beauty, but she possessed a stillness, a self-contained composure that was a different kind of power. Her gaze was not defiant, but it was clear and unnervingly direct. She did not shrink or tremble. She simply stood, present and whole, in the center of their world. In that suffocating silence, Elara understood. The Duchess Dowager had planned every detail of this marriage. She had chosen the bride, paid the price, and set the stage. She did not plan for the girl who arrived. The first weeks at Blackwood were a masterclass in polite, suffocating control. The Duchess Dowager, Isabella, governed the estate with an iron will disguised in velvet. Every meal, every social call, every moment of the day was scheduled, managed, and overseen. She instructed Elara on the running of the household, her tone that of a patient tutor with a particularly slow student. She dictated Elara's wardrobe, her menus, even the books she ought to be seen reading. Elara complied with a quiet grace that Isabella seemed to mistake for docility. She learnt the names of the 67 servants, the complex lineage of the neighboring families, and the precise unwritten rules of Blackwood society. She listened more than she spoke, her mind a placid surface beneath which observations gathered like riverstones. Her husband, the Duke Alastair, remained a remote and unreadable figure. He was polite, his manners impeccable, but he moved through the grand rooms of his home like a ghost. At their silent, formal dinners, presided over by his mother, he would speak only when directly addressed. Elara watched him, noting the faint, perpetual tension in his jaw, the way his eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the candlelit table. His only distinguishing feature was a faint, dark stain of ink that always seemed to linger on the edge of his right index finger, a small sign of a private life lived elsewhere, away from the oppressive perfection of his mother's world. He was a stranger to her, and she to him. Their marriage was a contract, their interactions a series of formal maneuvers, yet in his quietness she sensed not coldness, but a profound weariness. He was a man living in a house that was not his own, bearing a title whose power was wielded by another. He, too, was in a cage. One afternoon, seeking refuge from Isabella's relentless instruction, Elara wandered the grounds. She followed a half-hidden path, overgrown with ivy, and found herself before a large, forgotten greenhouse. Its glass panes were clouded with grime, several of them cracked. Weeds choked the entrance. It was a place of neglect, a testament to beauty abandoned. Driven by a curiosity she hadn't felt in years, she found the door unlocked and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Broken pots lay scattered across the floor, and the skeletons of long-dead plants stood in silent, brittle rows. But in the far corner, against a wall of grimy glass, was a single, miraculous survivor. A rosebush, gnarled and thick with thorns, was not only alive but stubbornly blooming. It bore a cluster of pale, ivory-colored roses, their petals edged with the faintest blush of pink. They bloomed in defiance of the cold, the neglect, the encroaching winter. A winter rose. She reached out and gently touched a petal, soft as worn silk. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood, she felt a flicker of connection, a kinship with this resilient, lonely thing. It was my grandmother's, a quiet voice said from the doorway. Elara turned, startled. Alistair stood there, his tall frame silhouetted against the grey afternoon. He stepped inside, his gaze on the rosebush. She cultivated them. She called them the Blackwood blush. No one has tended to them in 30 years. They are beautiful, Elara said softly. He looked from the roses to her, and for the first time, his gaze seemed to truly see her, not as the bride his mother had purchased, but as a person standing in a forgotten corner of his home. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his dark, tired eyes. The tools are in the shed behind. The key to the water pump is on the hook in the library, by the globe. He said nothing more. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her in the quiet company of the roses. It was not a conversation, not a connection, but it was a beginning. It was a key, offered without explanation, an act of quiet trust. It was the first crack in the armor of their cold, formal arrangement. Hope, a thing she had long considered a luxury, began to stir in her chest, fragile as a butterfly's wing testing the air after a storm. The greenhouse became her sanctuary. Every afternoon, Elara would retreat to its dusty silence, armed with shears, twine, and a fierce, quiet determination. She cleared the weeds, cleaned the glass, and carefully pruned the dead wood from the resilient rose bushes. The work was hard, her hands becoming calloused, her dress stained with earth, but it was honest. It was hers. It was an act of creation in a house dedicated to sterile preservation. Isabella, of course, noticed. A duchess does not grub in the dirt like a common gardener, she remarked one evening at dinner. Her voice laced with disapproval. It is unseemly. I will have the head gardener attend to it. Thank you, Your Grace, Elara replied, her voice even. But I find the work restorative. I would prefer to continue. She did not challenge, but she did not yield. It was a small act of defiance, so subtle that Isabella could not reprimand her without appearing tyrannical. Alistair said nothing, but Elara saw the way his eyes lingered on her hands at the dinner table, no longer pristine and pale, but marked by her labor. She felt his gaze, and it was not one of judgment. Her work in the greenhouse led her to the library in search of the key Alistair had mentioned. The library at Blackwood was a magnificent two-story room, filled with thousands of books bound in leather and gold. It was Alistair's domain, the one place his mother's influence seemed to wane. It smelled of old paper, beeswax, and the faint, acidic tang of ink. It was here that she saw the Duke not as a title, but as a man. He would spend hours at a massive desk, poring over documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. The ink stain on his finger a constant mark of his solitary work. One evening, while searching for a book on horticulture, she stumbled upon a recessed, unmarked door behind a row of towering bookshelves. Her curiosity piqued. She opened it. It led to a small, dusty office, clearly unused for decades. On a heavy oak desk sat stacks of enormous, leather-bound ledgers, a fine layer of dust covering their spines. The labels, written in a fading, elegant script, read Blackwood Estate Accounts, 1820-1825, and so on, stretching back half a century. This was the heart of the estate, not the grand ballroom or the perfectly manicured lawns, but these columns of figures, these records of harvests, rents, and investments. Her father, for all his failings as a baron, had insisted she learn mathematics and accounting, declaring it the only practical knowledge a woman of their station might ever need. He had been, for once, correct. She took one of the more recent ledgers, dated from the year Alistair's father had passed away. Night after night, after the great house fell silent, Elara would slip into the hidden office. By the light of a single candle, she began to read the story of Blackwood, not in words, but in numbers. What she found chilled her to the bone. Under the old Duke, the estate had been a model of prosperity. The farms were profitable, the tenants secure, the investments sound. But in the 10 years since his death, with the Duchess Dowager acting as the trustee of the estate's finances, a duty the late Duke had foolishly bestowed upon her in his will, trusting her vanity as a sign of shrewdness, a slow, insidious rot had set in. The ledgers showed a clear pattern. Funds were being diverted from essential maintenance, from repairing tenant cottages, from improving crop yields, from reinvesting in the land itself. Instead, vast sums were being spent on the superficial, on lavish London parties, on redecorating entire wings of the manor that were seldom used, on jewels and gowns for Isabella. The estate was being bled dry to maintain the appearance of immense wealth, while its foundations crumbled. This knowledge settled in her like a cold stone. This was the source of Alistair's weariness, the reason for the perpetual tension in his jaw. He was captain of a ship that was sinking, while his mother polished the brass and rearranged the deck chairs. Elara felt a surge of something fierce and protective. This was her home now. This was her husband's legacy. She would not stand by and watch it dissolve into ruin because of one woman's pride. She closed the ledger, the dust motes dancing in the candlelight. She had found her purpose here. She was no longer just tending to roses, she was tending to the roots of Blackwood itself. One night Alistair found her there. He had entered the library so quietly she hadn't heard him. He simply appeared in the doorway of the small office, his face pale in the candlelight. He looked at the open ledger on the desk, at the neat pages of notes she had been compiling, and a look of profound, weary resignation settled over his features. He did not look angry. He looked defeated. "So, you know," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of accusation. "You know the truth of this place. I know the numbers don't align with the expenditures." She replied carefully, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was a line being crossed, a conversation from which there was no retreat. He walked into the small room and sank into the chair opposite her. For a long moment, he just stared at the columns of figures, his hands clasped before him. The ink stain on his finger seemed darker than ever in the flickering light. "My father, he trusted her," Alistair began, his voice barely a whisper. He believed her vanity was a form of ambition, that she would guard the family's name and fortune as fiercely as she guarded her own reputation. He gave her control of the primary accounts in his will. He made me duke, but left her holding the purse strings until my 30th birthday. That day came and went. She refused to yield control, claiming I was not ready. The family solicitor, Mr. Davies, is loyal to her. My father's will was ambiguous enough for her to exploit. He finally looked at Elara, and the mask of aristocratic indifference was gone. In its place was a vulnerability so raw it made her breath catch. His eyes were filled with a desperate, trapped helplessness. I have spent the last 5 years fighting her in private. I present her with figures, with reports from the tenants, with warnings from the land agent. She dismisses it all as pessimism. She signs contracts to sell timber from the ancient woods to fund a new wing for the ballroom. She mortgages farmland to buy diamonds. She is selling the bones of this estate to dress the corpse in finery. He leaned forward, his voice cracking with a pain he had clearly held in for years. I am the Duke of Blackwood, and I am powerless to stop it. I am a prisoner in my own home, watching my inheritance turn to dust around me. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. She chose you, because you had no family, no fortune, no connections. She thought you would be pliable. Another beautiful, empty thing to decorate her house. He looked at her, at the ledgers spread between them, at the fierce, intelligent light in her eyes. She was wrong, he said, the words a simple statement of fact. In that moment, he was not a duke. He was a man admitting his deepest failure, his most profound fear. He had confessed his powerlessness, and in doing so, he had handed her the truth of their situation. He had shown her his vulnerable heart. Elara looked at the columns of numbers, the irrefutable proof of mismanagement and decay. It was no longer just about protecting an estate. It was about saving this man from the slow ruin his mother had orchestrated. She knew, with absolute certainty, what she had to do. Her words, when they came, fell into the tense room, not like stones, but like carefully placed seeds in ploughed earth, each one promising a harvest of consequence. Perhaps, she said, her voice steady and clear, she is not the only one who can speak to Mr. Davies. The breaking point came a week later. Isabella, triumphant, announced at breakfast that she had finalized an agreement to sell off the North Meadow, a vast and fertile tract of land that housed 3 of their most loyal tenant families. The proceeds, she declared, would be used to finance the upcoming London season and commission a set of new family portraits. It was a move of such breathtaking arrogance and short-sightedness that it felt like a declaration of war. Alistair went rigid, his face ashen. He opened his mouth to protest, but Isabella cut him off with a dismissive wave of her hand. It is all arranged, Alistair. Mr. Davies is drawing up the papers. He will be here this afternoon to finalize the details. It is done. Elara met her husband's desperate gaze across the table. She gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. That afternoon, the 3 of them gathered in the Duke's formal study. Mr. Davies, a portly man with a perpetually nervous expression, sat at the great mahogany desk, the contracts spread before him. Isabella stood by the fireplace, a smug, satisfied smile playing on her lips. Alistair stood by the window, his back to the room, his shoulders tight with helpless rage. The atmosphere was thick with tension. "If you will just sign here, Your Grace," Mr. Davies said, dipping a pen in the inkwell and offering it to Isabella. Just as her fingers reached for it, the study door opened. Elara entered. She had not been summoned. Her presence was an intrusion, a breach of protocol so profound that all 3 of them stared at her in stunned silence. She wore a simple dark blue gown, unadorned with lace or jewels. In her hands she carried not a fan or a book of poetry, but a single, heavy estate ledger. She closed the door softly behind her and walked toward the desk. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her steps were even, her expression serene. She ignored Isabella's gasp of outrage and Alistair's look of shocked uncertainty. Her focus was entirely on the solicitor. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Before Her Grace signs a document that will cripple this estate, I believe you have a duty to review its true financial standing. This is outrageous." Isabella snapped, "Elara, leave us at once. This is not your concern." Elara did not even look at her. She placed the ledger on the desk, open to a specific page. Beside it, she laid a single sheet of paper covered in her own neat, precise handwriting. "Here, Mr. Davies," she said calmly, "is the revenue from the North Meadow Farms for the last 5 years. And here is the projected income loss from their sale. And here," she tapped another column of figures in the ledger, "is the record of funds spent on the London season for those same 5 years. A net loss of staggering proportions." She moved with methodical grace, her finger tracing the lines of ink. "The Duchess Dowager is proposing to sell one of the estate's most valuable assets to fund its most significant liability. It is not an investment, it is a liquidation. She is not managing the Blackwood fortune, she is spending it into oblivion." Mr. Davies stared, his mouth slightly agape. He was a man of numbers, of contracts and consequences. Elara was not speaking the language of a society wife, she was speaking his language, with devastating fluency. "And here," Elara continued, her voice gaining strength, "is a proposal. A 5-year plan for reinvestment in the estate's core assets, repairing the tenants' roofs, which will cost a fraction of the proposed portraits, purchasing new, hardier seed stock, draining the waterlogged East Field. Small, prudent expenditures that will, according to my calculations, increase the estate's annual income by 30% within 3 years. She finally turned her gaze to Alistair. He was no longer looking out the window. He was staring at her, his expression a mixture of awe and dawning hope. He saw the path she had cleared for him. He straightened his shoulders, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked every inch the Duke. "Mr. Davies," Alistair said, his voice ringing with an authority she had never heard before. "My wife is correct. I have reviewed her proposal, and it has my full endorsement. The sale of the North Meadow is cancelled, effective immediately." Isabella's face had turned a mottled, furious red. "You cannot do this. The will, I have control." "You have control, Mother," Alistair said, his voice cold as steel. "So long as you act in the best interest of the estate. Mr. Davies, would you say that bankrupting it to fund a series of parties qualifies as acting in its best interest?" The solicitor paled, sweating under the weight of the Duke's gaze and the damning evidence in the ledger before him. He shook his head mutely. The foundation of Isabella's power, her alliance with the family's legal counsel, had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. She was beaten. The knowledge was stark and absolute in her eyes. All her life she had ruled through intimidation, tradition, and the control of wealth, and she had just been dismantled by a quiet girl with a book of numbers. "Mother," Alistair said, his voice softening slightly, but losing none of its newfound command. "The estate keys, the master set, and the keys to the accounts office, they belong to the Duchess of Blackwood now. It was not a request, it was a final, undeniable transfer of power." For a long moment, Isabella simply stood there, her world collapsing around her. Then, with a shuddering breath, she walked toward Elara. She did not raise her eyes. Her movements were stiff, her pride shattered. She stopped before her daughter-in-law, the woman she had chosen as a pawn who had just checkmated the Queen. With a jerky, agonized motion, Isabella sank into a low, formal curtsy, a gesture of deference so deep it was almost a kneel. From a hidden pocket in her gown, she produced a heavy iron ring of keys and held it up. "Your Grace," Isabella whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The keys clinked softly as Ilara's steady hand took them. The silence of her arrival had been a question. This was the answer. A year passed. The winter that followed was harsh, but for the first time in a decade. Blackwood Manor felt prepared for it. The tenants' roofs were repaired, their larders full. The ancient woods were quiet, the sound of the axe replaced by the sighing of the wind. The great house itself seemed to breathe easier, the oppressive, sterile perfection of Isabella's reign giving way to a more comfortable, lived-in warmth. Fires were lit in hearths that had long been cold. The doors to the library stood permanently open. Isabella remained, a quiet, ghost-like figure in the house she had once ruled. Her power was gone, her authority dismantled. She was treated with all the respect due a Duchess Dowager, but the iron ring of keys now hung from a hook in Ilara's office, the small, once-forgotten room behind the library, now the vibrant heart of the estate. One crisp winter afternoon, Ilara was in the greenhouse. It was her sanctuary no longer, but a flourishing symbol of the estate's revival. The glass panes were clean and whole, the air warm and humid with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. The Blackwood blush roses, once a single stubborn bush, now climbed the walls in a profusion of ivory and pink, their delicate scent a promise of life in the dead of winter. She was snipping a perfect half-opened bud when Alistair entered. He no longer moved like a ghost in his own home. His step was confident, his shoulders relaxed. He came and stood beside her, his gaze soft as he watched her work. The ink stain was still on his finger, but now it seemed less a mark of solitary labor and more a badge of shared purpose. They worked together now, poring over the ledgers, walking the fields, talking late into the night about crop rotation and tenant fares. They were partners. He reached out and gently took the rose from her fingers, his touch warm against hers. The land agent says the harvest was the best in 15 years, he said quietly, his voice filled with a peaceful satisfaction she now knew so well. Old Man Hemlock's son is asking for a loan to buy 2 more dairy cows. He says he'll have it paid back in 2 seasons. He will, Ilara said with a smile. His wife is clever with cheese. It's a sound investment. This was their conversation now, not of society gossip or lavish balls, but of the small, vital details of the life they were building, the land they were healing. Alistair lifted the rose and tucked it carefully into the coils of her hair. His fingers lingered for a moment at her temple, a touch that was both tender and reverent. You brought life back to this place, he said, his eyes meeting hers. To all of it. He gestured around the thriving greenhouse, but she knew he meant more. He meant the estate. He meant the tenants. He meant himself. She looked from the impossible beauty of the winter rose to the face of her husband and saw not a cold, distant duke, but the quiet, steadfast man she had chosen to stand with, and who in turn had chosen to stand with her. The silence that had greeted her upon her arrival had been a void, a space defined by a shattered expectation. The comfortable, breathing quiet that now settled between them was full of unspoken understanding, of shared respect, of a love that had grown slowly and steadily, like the roses, in the harshest of conditions. It was a love that was patient and quiet and real.